Hey everyone. As you probably know, naval history tends to focus on the biggest and most famous warships ever built. Battleships, aircraft carriers, and nuclear submarines usually get most of the attention. But throughout history, many Russian warships were underestimated when they first appeared. Some were criticized for their design, while others were simply overshadowed by larger vessels. Today we're going to take a closer look at some of the most underrated Russian warships ever built. And now, without wasting any more time, let's get started. After the Russian Revolution and Civil War, the Soviet Navy had to rebuild almost entirely from scratch. Shipyards were damaged, experienced engineers were limited, and industrial production struggled for years. Because of these challenges, Soviet naval designers often had to find unconventional solutions. Instead of copying Western naval doctrines directly, they focused on speed, missile firepower, and specialized operational roles. Geography also played a major role in shaping their decisions. The Baltic Sea, Arctic Ocean, and Black Sea required different types of ships than the open oceans where NATO fleets operated. As a result, many Soviet warships looked unusual to foreign observers. The Novik-class destroyer first appeared during the final years of the Russian Empire, but its influence extended well into the Soviet period. Introduced in 1913, these ships were among the fastest destroyers in the world at the time. Powered by advanced turbine engines, they could reach speeds exceeding 30 knots. For early 20th century naval technology, that was a remarkable achievement. The ships carried several 102mm guns along with torpedo tubes, making them effective both as escorts and attack vessels. Several survived the revolution and later served in the early Soviet fleet. Although often forgotten today, the Novik design laid the groundwork for future Soviet destroyer development. The Kirov-class cruiser represented the Soviet Union's first serious attempt to build modern cruisers after the revolution. Entering service in the late 1930s, these ships were based partly on Italian naval designs, but incorporated Soviet weapons and engineering systems. With a displacement of about 9,000 tons, they carried 9 powerful 180mm guns, mounted in triple turrets. Many Western analysts criticized the class for its relatively thin armor protection. However, Soviet naval doctrine emphasized speed and firepower over heavy protection. During World War II, Kirov-class cruisers served in the Baltic and Black Sea fleets, providing artillery support and escorting convoys under extremely difficult conditions. The Gnev-class destroyer became one of the most important destroyer classes in the Soviet Navy before World War II. Developed under Project 7, these ships displaced around 1,600 tons and carried 4 130mm guns along with torpedo launchers. Their design emphasized high speed and offensive capability. Unfortunately, early versions suffered from structural weaknesses and mechanical reliability problems. Because of these issues, the class was sometimes criticized by naval observers. Yet when the war began, these destroyers proved far more capable than expected. They escorted Arctic convoys, supported coastal defenses, and participated in numerous combat operations across multiple theaters. Soviet engineers quickly recognized the weaknesses of the original Project 7 destroyers and began developing an improved version. The result was Project 7U, sometimes known as the Sobrazitelny class. The most important change involved the layout of the propulsion system. Instead of placing boilers and turbines in a single sequence, engineers separated them into alternating compartments. This configuration increased survivability because damage to one compartment would not disable the entire propulsion system. Introduced in 1940, these ships retained the same primary armament, but significantly improved resilience during combat operations. Throughout World War II, they served in escort roles, coastal bombardment missions, and fleet screening operations. The Leningrad-class destroyer leader represented a different concept within Soviet naval planning. These ships were designed to command flotillas of smaller destroyers rather than operate independently. They were significantly larger than standard destroyers and carried heavier armament, including 5 130mm guns. One of their most impressive characteristics was speed. During sea trials, some ships exceeded 40 knots, making them among the fastest large destroyers of their era. This speed allowed them to coordinate fleet maneuvers and lead destroyer attacks effectively. Although early Soviet engineering sometimes caused reliability problems, the class still played an important operational role during the Second World War. Few Soviet destroyers earned a reputation as dramatic as the Tashkent. Built in Italy and commissioned into the Soviet Navy in 1939, the ship combined Italian hull design with Soviet weapon systems. Its sleek structure and powerful engines allowed it to reach speeds exceeding 40 knots. Assigned to the Black Sea Fleet, Tashkent quickly became famous for its daring transport and evacuation missions during World War II. The ship repeatedly sailed through heavily contested waters to deliver supplies and evacuate soldiers and civilians. German aircraft attacked it constantly, yet it continued operating until finally being sunk in 1942. Its wartime service made it one of the most respected destroyers in Soviet naval history. The Chapayev-class cruiser represented a transitional step between wartime Soviet cruisers and the emerging Cold War fleet. Although the design was finalized during World War II, most of the ships were completed only after the conflict had ended. With a displacement of roughly 13,000 tons, they carried 12 152mm guns arranged in 4 triple turrets. Compared with earlier Soviet cruisers, the class also featured stronger anti-aircraft defenses and improved radar systems. These upgrades reflected lessons learned during the war, especially the growing threat from aircraft. While they rarely appear in dramatic naval battles, Chapayev-class cruisers became important training ships and fleet command vessels during the early Cold War. The Kotlin-class destroyer marked one of the first major post-war destroyer designs of the Soviet Navy. Entering service in the mid-1950s, these ships were intended to replace aging wartime destroyers that were becoming obsolete. Displacing around 3,500 tons, the class carried modern radar equipment along with traditional naval guns. Initially, they were built as conventional gun destroyers. However, several vessels were later modified to carry surface-to-air missiles as naval technology rapidly evolved. Because they appeared relatively simple compared with newer missile ships, the Kotlin class rarely attracts attention in naval history. Yet, these destroyers played a critical role in bridging the gap between World War II-era warships and the missile fleets of the Cold War. The Sverdlov-class cruiser was one of the last large gun cruisers ever built in significant numbers. Introduced in the early 1950s, these ships displaced more than 16,000 tons and carried 12 152mm guns supported by heavy anti-aircraft batteries. At a time when missile technology was beginning to dominate naval warfare, many Western analysts considered such ships outdated almost immediately. However, the Soviet Navy continued operating them for decades. Sverdlov-class cruisers served as command ships, training vessels, and diplomatic flagships during international naval visits. They helped demonstrate Soviet naval power across the world's oceans during the early stages of the Cold War. The Kinda-class cruiser represented a completely different approach to naval warfare. Introduced in the early 1960s, these ships were among the first Soviet warships designed primarily around anti-ship missiles rather than naval guns. With a displacement of about 5,600 tons, they carried large P-35 cruise missiles intended to strike enemy carrier groups from long distances. To Western observers, the ships looked unusual, with massive missile launchers dominating the deck. Some critics argued that their relatively small size made them vulnerable. Yet within Soviet naval doctrine, the Kinda class was designed to deliver powerful missile strikes as part of coordinated fleet operations. The Cresta-1 class cruiser expanded on this missile warfare concept. Entering service in the mid-1960s, the class combined anti-ship missiles with anti-submarine weapons and advanced radar systems. These ships also carried helicopters to extend their detection range against submarines. At around 7,000 tons displacement, they were designed to operate within larger task forces rather than independently. Western analysts often judged them by comparison with larger NATO cruisers, which sometimes led to underestimating their role. In practice, the Cresta-1 ships helped establish the Soviet Navy's growing emphasis on multi-mission missile combatants during the Cold War. The improved Cresta-2 class cruiser shifted the focus even further toward anti-submarine warfare. Introduced in the late 1960s, these ships featured more advanced sonar systems and long-range anti-submarine missiles. Their mission was closely tied to protecting Soviet ballistic missile submarines, which formed a key part of the country's nuclear deterrent. By escorting these submarines and defending patrol areas, Cresta-2 cruisers played a quiet but vital strategic role. Although they lacked the dramatic appearance of missile battlecruisers, their specialized mission made them essential to Soviet naval operations during the Cold War. The Kara-class cruiser continued the evolution of Soviet anti-submarine surface ships. Entering service in the early 1970s, they were among the first Soviet warships powered by gas turbine engines rather than traditional steam turbines. This change allowed faster acceleration and reduced mechanical complexity. The ships carried powerful radar systems, anti-submarine weapons, and surface-to-air missiles for fleet defense. Kara-class cruisers frequently deployed far from Soviet waters, particularly in the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean. Their presence demonstrated the Soviet Navy's growing ability to operate globally during the height of the Cold War. The Cravac-1 class frigate was designed as a reliable escort vessel capable of protecting larger ships from submarine threats. Introduced in the late 1960s, the class displaced around 3,200 tons and carried advanced sonar equipment along with anti-submarine missiles. Compared with large cruisers and destroyers, these ships appeared relatively modest, yet their reliability and versatility made them extremely valuable. Dozens were built, and they served throughout the Soviet fleet for many years. In many ways, the Cravac-1 frigates represented the practical backbone of Soviet naval escort forces during the Cold War. The Cravac-2 class frigate represented an improved version of the earlier Cravac escort ships. Introduced during the 1970s, the new variant featured upgraded radar systems, better electronic warfare equipment, and stronger air defense capabilities. While the overall design remained similar to the original class, these improvements made the ships more adaptable to modern naval threats. Their primary mission remained anti-submarine warfare and fleet escort duties. Although they rarely appear in popular naval histories, Cravac-2 frigates served for decades and became one of the most reliable escort vessels in the Soviet fleet. The Cravac-3 class frigate marked the final evolution of the Cravac design. Developed during the late Cold War and continuing into the post-Soviet period, this version incorporated further modernization, including improved missile systems and updated sensors. The ships displaced around 4,000 tons and maintained strong anti-submarine capabilities while gaining better surface warfare systems. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, several ships of this design continued serving in the Russian Navy. Despite receiving little public attention compared to larger warships, the Cravac-3 class demonstrated the long-term effectiveness of the original design concept. The Udaloy-class destroyer was designed primarily to counter the growing threat posed by NATO submarines during the Cold War. Entering service in the early 1980s, these ships displaced more than 7,000 tons and carried powerful sonar systems, along with long-range anti-submarine missiles. They also operated helicopters specifically designed to hunt submarines. Because the class focused heavily on anti-submarine warfare, it initially lacked strong anti-ship missile armament. This led some analysts to underestimate the design. However, within Soviet naval strategy, protecting ballistic missile submarines was one of the most critical missions of the entire fleet. The Sovremeny-class destroyer complemented the Udaloy class by focusing on surface combat. Introduced in the 1980s, these ships carried powerful Mosquet anti-ship missiles, capable of traveling at extremely high speeds. They were also equipped with twin 130mm naval guns, giving them strong firepower against both surface and coastal targets. With a displacement of around 8,000 tons, Sovremeny-class destroyers became some of the most heavily armed surface combatants in the Soviet Navy. Although they rarely receive as much attention as larger cruisers, their combination of missiles and artillery made them formidable ships. The Slava-class cruiser emerged as one of the most recognizable Soviet warships of the late Cold War. Entering service in the early 1980s, these cruisers were designed specifically to threaten NATO carrier groups. Their most distinctive feature was a set of 16 large anti-ship missiles mounted along the sides of the superstructure. These missiles were intended to overwhelm carrier defenses through coordinated mass attacks. Despite being smaller than the massive Kirov-class battlecruisers, Slava-class ships delivered tremendous offensive capability. Several remain active in the Russian Navy today. The Kirov-class battlecruiser represented one of the most ambitious naval projects of the Soviet era. When the first ship entered service in 1980, it became the largest surface combatant built since World War II. Powered by nuclear reactors, the ships could operate at sea for extremely long periods without refueling. Their weapon systems included long-range anti-ship missiles, advanced air defense systems, and numerous close defense weapons. Because of their enormous size and cost, the class was often criticized as impractical. Yet the Kirov battlecruisers demonstrated the Soviet Union's ability to build warships capable of challenging Western naval dominance. The new Strashimi-class frigate was developed during the final years of the Soviet Union as a new generation of multi-purpose escort ships. With a displacement of about 4,400 tons, these vessels combined anti-submarine weapons, anti-ship missiles, and modern radar systems. The design also included a helicopter hangar to support airborne anti-submarine operations. Only a small number of ships were completed due to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, the class represented an important step toward more modern Russian naval designs. Even today, the surviving ships continue serving in the Russian fleet after multiple upgrades. The Admiral Grigorovich-class frigate represents one of the first successful surface combatant programs launched by Russia after the difficult years that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union. Entering service in the 2000s, these ships were designed as relatively compact but heavily armed multi-role frigates. With a displacement of around 4,000 tons, they carry modern radar systems and a vertical launch system capable of firing caliber cruise missiles. During Russian operations in Syria, ships of this class launched long-range strikes from the Mediterranean Sea. Despite their moderate size, the Admiral Grigorovich class demonstrated that modern Russian warships could deliver strategic firepower far beyond their immediate region. The Staragushi class corvette represents a different direction in modern Russian naval design. Rather than building only large destroyers and cruisers, Russia also invested in smaller, stealth-oriented warships designed for coastal and regional operations. Entering service in the late 2000s, Staragushi-class ships displace about 2,200 tons and incorporate reduced radar signatures along with modern sensors and missile systems. These vessels can conduct anti-ship, anti-submarine, and air defense missions despite their relatively small size. Although they rarely receive the attention given to larger warships, they form an increasingly important part of Russia's modern naval strategy. The Buyan M-class missile corvette became unexpectedly famous in 2015 when several ships launched caliber cruise missiles from the Caspian Sea toward targets in Syria. The missiles traveled more than 1,500 kilometers before striking their objectives. With a displacement of under 1,000 tons, these ships were originally designed for coastal patrol missions. However, the addition of vertical launch missile systems transformed them into highly capable strike platforms. Their performance demonstrated that even small vessels operating in inland seas could deliver long-range precision attacks. The Karakurt-class missile corvette expanded on this concept of small but heavily armed warships. Introduced in the late 2000s and 10s, the class was designed to improve upon the seakeeping limitations of the Bouillon-M design. Karakurt ships displace roughly 800 tons, but carry the same caliber or Onyx cruise missiles used by larger warships. This allows them to threaten targets far beyond their size category. Their compact design makes them suitable for operations in confined seas such as the Baltic or Black Sea, while still providing significant offensive capability. The Admiral Gorshkov-class frigate is widely considered the most advanced surface combatant currently operating in the Russian Navy. With a displacement of around 5,400 tons, these ships incorporate modern radar systems, stealth shaping, and a universal vertical launch system capable of firing a wide variety of missiles. This allows the frigates to perform multiple missions, including air defense, anti-ship warfare, and long-range land attack. Early in the program, construction delays and technical challenges raised doubts about its success. However, once the first ships entered service, they quickly demonstrated their importance as the future backbone of Russia's surface fleet. One of the most remarkable warships still being modernized today is the battlecruiser Admiral Nakhimov. Originally commissioned during the Soviet era as part of the Kirov class, the ship has been undergoing an extensive modernization program intended to transform it into one of the most heavily armed surface combatants in the world. The upgrades include new radar systems, advanced air defense missiles, and large numbers of cruise missiles. When it eventually returns to service, Admiral Nakhimov is expected to carry one of the largest missile arsenals ever placed on a surface warship. Finally, there is the aircraft carrier Admiral Kuznetsov, the only carrier currently operated by the Russian Navy. Commissioned in the early 1990s, the ship has often attracted criticism because of maintenance issues and long refit periods. Yet, despite these challenges, it remains a crucial platform for Russian naval aviation. In 2016, the carrier deployed to the Mediterranean during the Syrian conflict, launching combat aircraft against ground targets. While it may not match the scale of American carrier groups, Admiral Kuznetsov still plays an important role in maintaining Russia's carrier aviation capabilities. Looking across more than a century of Russian naval development, a clear pattern emerges. Many Soviet and Russian warships were designed with very specific strategic purposes rather than general-purpose dominance. Destroyers protected convoys and coastal waters. Missile cruisers were built to threaten NATO carrier groups. Smaller corvettes and frigates were designed to operate effectively in enclosed seas near Russian territory. When these ships are judged solely by Western naval standards, they sometimes appear less impressive. But within the strategic environment they were designed for, many proved extremely capable. The history of Russian naval development shows that reputation does not always reflect reality. Many warships, once dismissed as flawed or outdated designs, later proved to be effective and influential. From early destroyers like the Novik to modern missile corvettes and frigates, these ships played important roles in shaping naval strategy across multiple generations. Some were overshadowed by larger and more famous vessels, while others were misunderstood because of their unconventional design choices. Yet together, they reveal an important lesson in naval history. The true value of a warship is not always measured by size or reputation, but by how effectively it performs the mission it was built to accomplish.